Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to start out with the Reverend Ian Paisley, also known as Lord Bandside, who died recently at the age of 88. He was the fiery Protestant minister who was the head of the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland. To briefly review, Ireland was split in 1922 into Ireland and Northern Ireland. Ireland primarily Catholic, Northern Ireland primarily Protestant. It's about 60-40. And since 1922, and especially in the 1960s and 70s, there was very bitter fighting in Northern Ireland, basically whether to break away from England and unify with Ireland or not. Protestants being on the side of retaining allegiance to England, Catholics being on the side of unifying with Ireland. Combining his religious skills and his political skills, Reverend Paisley was radically anti-Catholic and radically against unification, but ultimately events proved against him, and in 1998 the Good Friday Agreement was signed, which allowed Northern Ireland to remain independent, but created a Catholic-Protestant coalition government in Northern Ireland. Ultimately, Reverend Paisley joined the coalition government and worked very well with the Catholics in the government, including one of the heads of the IRA, who was also in the government, Sinn Fein's Martin McGuinness. So he basically had a sort of end-of-life conversion. Here is Britain's Channel 4 on the Reverend Ian Paisley. Just to clarify for those who are unfamiliar, Ulster is Northern Ireland, the Unionists are the Protestants, the Catholics are the Republicans, and Sinn Fein is the major Catholic Republican Party.
Ulster shall remain firm to the very end. Keep Ulster out of the side of Ireland. No!
For decades, Ian Paisley raged against all compromise with the Catholic community in Northern Ireland.
Sinn Fein are so stained with our blood that it would take 100 years to pass before you could acknowledge them as even decent.
But in 2007, Ian Paisley went into power with Sinn Fein, governing and chuckling side by side with the former IRA commander and Sinn Fein leader, Martin McGuinness.
There are some words from Holy Scripture, and it says, "We know not what a day may bring forth." If you had told me some time ago that I'd be standing here to take this office, I would have been totally unbelieving.
Ian Paisley was a street politician and an agitator who through the 1960s and 70s helped to frustrate every attempt to get the Protestant community to share power with Catholics in Northern Ireland. He served a 3-month prison sentence for public order offences.
It's a real thrill to me this afternoon to be out of the clink and to be in freedom.
Some loyalist paramilitaries claim that Ian Paisley's anti-Catholic rhetoric spurred them to violence. Ian Paisley openly flirted with paramilitarism in the 1980s, forming the Ulster Resistance, whose members threatened to take on Republicans.
Revealed that this was indeed the launch of a new force to be named Ulster Resistance.
We say never! Never! Never!
He led the opposition to Margaret Thatcher's Anglo-Irish Agreement, which allowed Dublin to be consulted on Northern Ireland matters. His splinter party was still the junior voice in Ulster unionism, but usually the loudest.
I'm convinced that the Protestant faith is right.
He was the leader of his own splinter church, too. He despised Catholicism, once barracked Pope John Paul II in the European Parliament, calling him the Antichrist.
Paisley, I now exclude you from this house.
No surrender.
Hear, hear.
After the IRA's ceasefire, Ian Paisley boycotted the Good Friday Agreement talks. But while he was demonstrating outside, a new Northern Ireland was taking shape inside. Republicans were coming in from the cold.
What we have, we hold.
Ian Paisley lost the referendum on the Good Friday Agreement, but his party prospered as unionist voters resented what they saw as sickening concessions to Sinn Fein. 9 years after the Good Friday Agreement he condemned as treachery, he embraced it as First Minister, power-sharing with Sinn Fein.
Today, at long last, we are starting upon the road. I emphasize starting, which I believe will take us to lasting peace in our province.
Ian Paisley said he hadn't shifted his beliefs, but Northern Ireland had moved on.
Oh, I wonder why people hate me, because I'm such a nice man.
Tony Blair was convinced that earlier heart trouble Ian Paisley suffered had made him ponder his own mortality and embrace change.
To know the Lord is the greatest thing you can know.
Ian Paisley preached at his East Belfast church for 65 years. His last sermon warned of eternal darkness and the terrors of hell. The fire and brimstone preaching carried to the end, even if the politics had changed beyond recognition.
Well, we're going to briefly cleanse your palate from the fires of hell and the Antichrist to Joe Sample, who died recently at the age of 75. Joe Sample was a jazz pianist, keyboard player, composer, and arranger. He was the founder of the Jazz Crusaders in 1971, which ultimately became known as the Crusaders. Sample and the Crusaders played a lot of their own stuff, but they also guested on a lot of recordings by other performers, including George Benson, B.B. King, Eric Clapton, Steely Dan, and Miles Davis. Crusaders started out playing hard bop, which was sort of popular on the West Coast in the late 60s and early 70s, but then they sort of morphed their style into a fusion of gospel, jazz, blues, and a couple of other forms. Here's Joe Sample playing one of his own compositions called The Last Child. Yeah, that's nice stuff. I'm going to close tonight with our feature, Bob Crewe, who died recently at the age of 83. I love Bob Crewe. Bob Crewe came out of New Jersey. He was a Jersey boy, and like Joe Sample, he was fantastically talented. He was an arranger, a producer, a songwriter. He did everything. He wanted to do show music, but he gradually gravitated into rock and roll. And you may be familiar with some of the songs he wrote in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. In the late 50s, during the doo-wop craze on the East Coast, he wrote this song for the Rays.
Took a walk and past your house late last night. All the shades were pulled and drawn way down tight. From within the dim light cast, two silhouettes on the shade. Oh, what a lovely couple they made.
You may be more familiar with the 1960s remake British Invasion version by Herman's Hermits.
Took a walk and past your house late last night. All the shades were pulled and drawn way down tight. From within the dim light cast, two silhouettes on the shade. Oh, what a lovely couple they made.
He also wrote a pretty big hit in the 70s, a sort of a pre-disco thing for Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells.
Hello, hey Joe, you wanna give it a go? Your lady mama
And in the mid-60s, he had his own hit. He didn't write this one, but he put together some studio cats, and they call themselves the Bob Crewe Generation. Who are we kidding? None of that makes Bob Crewe famous. He is indelibly linked to four other Jersey boys known as the Four Seasons. You've seen the movie or the play Jersey Boys, you know that Bob Crewe was instrumental in their success, and he helped create most of their hits either through writing and arranging, including three immortal classics. He helped put the Four Seasons on the map with their first immortal classic. He did not write it, he arranged it. He saw Frankie Valli, their lead singer, singing in a club one night. Frankie was goofing around, put some maracas in his shirt to look like a girl, and sang that wonderful falsetto of his, and Bob Crewe told the songwriter-keyboardist of the Four Seasons, Bob Gaudio, to write something with that falsetto range in it, and they came up with this that Bob Crewe arranged. It's one of the songs that changed the face of rock and roll. Originally called Jackie for Jackie Kennedy, he was at the height of her popularity in 1962. huge #1 in 1962, and Bob Crewe was inextricably linked with the Four Seasons and started writing with Bob Gaudio. Here are a couple of the songs they wrote together that I really like that also became big hits for the Four Seasons. And not only Crewe's writing, but his arrangement had a lot to do with it. Here's Big Girls Don't Cry.
Big girls don't cry. Big girls don't cry. Big girls, they don't cry. Big girls don't cry. Who said they don't cry?
Here's more Crewe Gaudio magic on the Four Seasons run. It didn't reach #1, but I thought it was one of their best.
Girl, can you remember and walk for me? Ronnie, 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 I am regretting but can't stop forgetting because you were my first love.
Crewe and Gaudio also wrote this one for the Four Seasons, but it became a bigger hit by the Tremolos, the group that was taken by Decca instead of the Beatles. But I'll play a little bit of the Four Seasons version of Silence is Golden.
Oh, don't it pain to see someone cry? Oh, especially when someone is hurt. Silence is golden. Silence is golden, golden. What my eyes still see.
Well, I said that Crewe was associated with 3 absolute rock and roll classics. The first was Sherry, where he was the arranger. In the mid-1960s, Tommy DeVito of the Four Seasons had accumulated huge gambling debts. He was into the mob for about $1 million. Frankie Valli assumed those debts, and he had to generate about $2 million to pay them off. He and Bob Gaudio created a partnership where Frankie would sing the songs that Bob Gaudio wrote to hopefully generate that kind of money. Bob Gaudio and Bob Crewe got together, and they wrote a song that wasn't exactly rock and roll. It was sort of a mainstream thing you might hear at the Copacabana, but even then it was a little different than that. It became the second great rock and roll classic for Bob Crewe, one of the greatest songs in rock and roll history, in large measure because of Frankie Valli singing.
You're just too good to be true. Can't take my eyes off you. I love you, baby. Trust in me when I say, oh, pretty baby, don't bring me down, baby. Now that I found this way, let me love you, baby. Let me love you.
Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps, and we're going to close with what I think was Bob Crewe's best songwriting composition along with Bob Gaudio. And it's the third of the rock and roll classics associated with Bob Crewe. After Jersey Boys came out with all the great Four Seasons songs that it was about, I told my daughter Charlotte, who loves the Four Seasons, that the best Crewe Gaudio composition wasn't even a hit for the Four Seasons. She was a little skeptical about that, but then here's a guy who should know, Bob Gaudio, talking about his favorite Crewe Gaudio composition.
If you were to ask me what's your favorite song that you've written, I'd have to say The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore.
Well, to me, that is the best Bob Crewe, Bob Gaudio song, and of course the definitive version is not by Frankie Valli. The definitive version is by the Walker Brothers. It went to #1 in England. The Walker Brothers, of course, were not named Walker originally, and they were not brothers. But you'll never hear a better record, one of the classics of rock and roll, than their version of Bob Crewe and Bob Gaudio's The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore, which we'll play as a closing tribute to Bob Crewe.
Loneliness